Sangat Ji, in this podcast episode, we converse about the Akhand Kirtan Jatha with Bhai Jujhar Singh Ji and Bhai Kamaljt Singh Ji. Bhai Jujhar Singh Ji is actually the great-grandson of Bhai Sahib Randhir Singh Ji, who is known as the founder of the Akhand Kirtan Jatha. We touch briefly on Bhai Sahibs Jeevan, how it all started, the musicality of the Akhand Kirtan style, and more generally, the Jatha in more depth in the past all the way to today. Upon reflection, what I most appreciated about this conversation was the willingness to share the story of the Jatha and be open to conversation on some of the misconceptions I've certainly heard about the Jatha on my journey so far, as well as the unique musicality of the Jatha Kirtan and understanding of the Khalsa Panth as a diverse multi-jathebandi Dharam. Albeit, each jathebandi has many great virtues or gun, who all provide a unique service to the Panth in their own unique and beautiful way. We mustn't forget that the one thing that keeps us together is the Guru, Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj. I feel this conversation presents a sincere undertone for Panthic oneness and prosperity, and I trust you will probably feel this too. Massive thank you to Sangat TV for providing me the space to have this discussion, and please forgive us for any mistakes. Lastly, please hit like and comment your thoughts as well as sharing this episode with those who may benefit from it to help this podcast grow. Here is Bhai Jujhar Singh Ji and Bhai Kamaljt Singh Ji. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to the Kirtan 5 podcast by Jujhar Singh Ji and Bhai Kamaljt Singh Ji. What I want to just get off the bat straight away is Riji. So, Bhai Jujhar Singh, you're the direct descendant of Bhai Sahib Randhir Singh, right? Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
Hanji, so Bhai Sahib was my great-grandfather. So that's my mother's side. So he was my mom's Dadaji. So yeah, my Purnana Ji was Bhai Sahib.
Wow, that's amazing. So what's your role within Akhand Kirtan Jatha at the moment? So you're a Jathedar, right? Is it?
So within the Jatha, every few years there's a selection of Sevadars to sort of do the Seva for that period. So at the moment, I've been selected as one of the Sevadars for that, for the Jatha in the UK.
Wonderful. And Bhai Kamaljt Singh Ji, what's your role within the Jatha and your background in the Jatha?
My role in Jatha at the moment is probably a member of the Sangat, a listener to Kirtan, an avid listener to Kirtan and a big fan of Kirtan. I have previously served in the same sort of way Jujhar Singh has, in the sort of Sevadars that sort of look after the running of the Jatha day to day. I've been involved in Jatha or listening to Jatha Kirtan for well over 40 years now, right? And essentially grew up around Jatha again.
Wonderful. And before we start with getting into the details, I just need to get this question off my chest. Riji, is there any recordings of Bhai Sahib Randhir Singh that we know that exist that perhaps haven't been shared yet, but just do we know if they exist or not?
It's a good question and one that I've been asked, several times.
Yeah.
I'd like to say yes. But unfortunately, not one that we're aware of. From speaking to family members and Singhs who were around at the time of Bhai Sahib, there were a couple of occasions where I think there was a recording attempted, or there was recordings of Kirtan a couple of times where I think one was in Delhi, where he did the Shabad Makita Na Jata Haram Khor, and then there was another Gursikh who came from Africa, we believe, who did a recording, but no one has any traces of either of those Gursikhs who did those recordings. So maybe they will turn up one day. I'm hoping they will, but at the moment I can't say that we've heard Bhai Sahib's Kirtan.
Wow, amazing. I'm assuming you've obviously probably done quite a lot of coverage to try and find those recordings, right? So through the network and just people in the Jatha. So yeah, if you haven't been able to find them, then I'm not sure how anyone else will, to be honest with you. Hopefully we can find something, but Saaj Kirpa Karan. So what's actually the earliest known recordings of Jatha Kirtan then, if we don't have the original dating back to Bhai Sahib Randhir Singh?
Hanji, so Bhai Sahib, his Agal Chalana was 1961. So I think there are some recordings which go back to the 1960s, so probably just after Bhai Sahib Ji left this earth. and those are available online. The recordings of famous Kirtani within Jatha, like Bhai Meher Singh Ji, Bhai Jeevan Singh Ji, Bhai Joginder Singh Ji Talwara. So they're available online.
So you must have quite an expansive collection of Kirtan yourself, right? I assume you probably have like cassettes or tapes or CDs, that you've collected over your life. What's that look like right now?
It's easier now because you can record on any device, right? But back in the day when we were young, we used to collect a lot of CDs, tapes, even if anyone remembers what those are.
Yeah.
MDs.
MDs,
yes, yeah.
Okay.
In my earlier days, we used to record on MDs.
Yeah.
So I probably got a few of them flying around somewhere. Before that, I guess my interest, I think my dad used to record. He was an electrical engineer.
All right.
And you can appreciate back in those days, you don't have phones. You probably need the right equipment. Reels and all those, tape recorders, to mics, and to set up and do that. So, as he was an electrical engineer, he had access to some of that equipment. So he would often record up and down UK. A lot of the Kirtan Samagams, most of them were Gyani Molak Singh, doing Kirtan in Leeds or Birmingham, but also was quite involved in the Gurdwara in Southall, Singh Sabha. Southall, he did Seva there for a number of years. And so, any Raagis that used to come to the UK would often go to that Gurdwara. Bhai Jujhar Singh, Bhai Jujhar Singh Ji, Bhai Dharam Singh Zakhmi, Bhai Shamsher Singh Zakhmi. So we've got a lot of recordings. Unfortunately, they're still on tapes, so maybe we can convert them at some point.
That would be amazing, actually.
A lot of the Kirtan that you have, Gyani Ji, in the 70s, 80s, was mostly my dad's recordings.
Wow, amazing. And Viji, Kamaljt Singh, so what's your Kirtan collection look like? You must have quite a lot.
So my Kirtan collection now doesn't look like much, I guess, but there was a point at which I would say, if you imagine like the sort of drawers that you would get in a bedroom, right under the mirror, right under a dressing table, I probably had an entire like 5-drawer thing like that full of cassettes. I'm probably from an era before MDs and CDs, right? I'm not even sure what they are, right? I was very much the TDK D90 guy, right?
Right.
And them cassette tapes, right? I had them fully catalogued, right, by like Kirtaniya and numbered by Kirtaniya and so on, right? We'll obviously get to talk about some of the Kirtaniya later on, but I had in excess of 100 tapes of like SDO, the Singh SDOs, right, alone, and then Talwara Ji, Bhai Jeevan Singh and so on. And eventually, I think when I realized that kind of it's the end of the road for this stuff, right, I boxed a lot of it up and distributed it to youngsters who had the knowledge and know-how to transfer a lot of that Kirtan. So I wouldn't know where any of those collections are. I know that quite a lot of the tapes through Rishpal Singh actually went to Denmark, and singing Denmark converted some of those recordings and so on. Right? But yeah, it was a thing in them days. It was a big part of how can you say, almost like as a hobbyist, right?
Yes.
That's what we used to do with amongst friends, is exchange, Kirtan tapes and so on. I've got this recording, what have you got, right? And we'd swap tapes at Kirtan programs.
Right, basically. Like a Kirtan mixtape, and then pass it on to friends, like listen to these shabads or like this Kirtani. Yeah. 100%. I remember actually, like, because I used to learn tabla at Martindale Gurdwara in Hounslow.
Okay.
In Hounslow. And I remember there used to be a store where all the like Bharat Akhand Kirtan tapes used to be like Toronto Smagam, like 97 or something, or like even earlier than 93. I remember just buying full collections and asking Mom, can I buy these like tapes? And then just going home and just constantly just listening to them again and again.
It makes me laugh to hear you say Bharatan and then say 97.
You look a lot younger than you are, Viji, I promise you. One thing I really would also like to ask you, Viji, is what's it like to grow up in a parivar like of Bhai Randhir Singh? Like even just like putting aside the name, just a Mahapurkh, like what's it like?
I think looking back, it's quite humbling. Going to Kirtan Samagams, I remember as a kid, you see, like you just describe stalls, you see stalls of Bhai Sahibs books, on there, and your mum coming home and telling you the connection that you have, obviously, being her granddad, and then you're kind of thinking, why, how, what is this? What has he done to, I guess, deserve so much pyar from the Sangat? And then slowly, as you grow older, I started reading some of Bhai Sahib's books, the autobiography, Jail Chittiyan, which is the most, I guess, prominent of his writings. He's written, a lot of other on a lot of other topics, but that's the one which I think most people have read or know about, and has changed lives. So when you hear, someone's Jeevan has changed lives, and you're sort of connected to that person, or you have direct relationship, I think you get inspired as well. So I guess, just growing up, visiting India, spending time with Nana Ji, who's obviously Bhai Sahib's son, hearing about, the experiences that they had. And, Nana Ji has got a lot of contribution towards the books. Obviously, all the writings that Bhai Sahib wrote, him and Gyani Narsingh had collected into writings which are now sort of available, in most smargams around the world. And also getting access to spending time with other Gursikhs of that era, who spent first-hand, with Bhai Sahib in Sangat, doing Kirtan, and hearing those stories, sometimes those really inspiring. And in, I think, 2011, we got an opportunity to go out to India and record interviews with some of those Gursikhs, which we are collating into a documentary, which we'll talk later about.
I think the main point, from Jujhar Singh's sort of comments there is that impact of Jail Chittiyan itself. I had sort of family connections in Jatha, but in terms of my own journey in Sikhi, apart from as a real youngster reading things like Sikh Missionary Society books on Guru Nanak Dev Ji and Gurbani Singh Ji that we probably all passed through all our hands. But the first real book on Sikhi that I read was Jail Chittiyan as well, and it is mind blowing, and when I read it the first time, I must have probably read it 3 times in succession, right? Because it had such a profound impact. And, I'm not sitting here saying that I'm the only person, you see. I think that's the key point that Jujhar Singh's probably making. There's so many people out there that could tell you exactly the same story I'm telling you, right? That it was just that one single book, because it just, the lens that it makes you look through in terms of Sikhi ki Jija, right? What is Sikhi? It kind of really models it in a whole different way, right? In terms of the true spiritual substance of what Sikhi is, and how somebody lives it, and how somebody lives it at all costs, right? At the level of willing to basically, give their own life, but basically not compromise on their Sikhi, right? And I guess ultimately it kind of very quickly homes in on what is actually the real essence of Sikhi. The focus of Naam Bani, and basically your cheez, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿਸੇ ਵੀ situation ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੈਗੇ, whatever your life situation is, right, that is the only thing that ultimately carries you through.
So what is Akhand Kirtan Jatha?
So today, as you say, Akhand Kirtan Jatha is an organization. Initially, it didn't start off as Akhand Kirtan Jatha. In Bhai Sahib's days, it was just a Jatha which went from place to place and did Kirtan. And, because that's what they loved. That's what their life was about. Their ishq was just Kirtan. And in those days, they were referred to as Nirvan Kirtan Jatha or Bhai Randhir Singh Jatha. And like I said, just went from place to place, village to village, doing Kirtan and showing their love of Kirtan, but also their prachar through that Kirtan. So interestingly, initially, when Bhai Sahib and their Jatha went from pind to pind, they weren't they weren't just doing Kirtan. It started off as doing Akhand parts, Amar Sanchars, and then at the Pog of the Akhand part, there'd be Asadivar, which would in the form of Kirtan, which would last hours, and in some cases go on till the evening, and then a Ranswai would start. So it would just go on for hours and hours. So it's become known as Akhand Kirtani Jatha, but it started off as, that prachar of Akhand parts, Amar Sanchars, so that focus on Gurbani, and Guru Sahib and the Maryada.
The Jatha, how many individuals would that have been alongside Bhai Sahibs Ji? Because if they're doing Amrit Sanchars, I assume obviously there's a minimum bunch thing, right? So then, what does that Jatha look like? You see, in terms of numbers?
I think we need to sort of draw a bit of a distinction here with, let's say, a formally established institution or organization, right? Jatha wasn't that, and it never has been. And some people say even now it's not that really, right? It was literally, as Jujhar Singh said, right? I would say a key point to note here is, like a number of other movements of the time, and which you can sort of summarize as the Singh Sabalera almost, if you like. The Jatha was a reformist movement, right? It was a group of Singhs who decided, right, we want to kind of rewind the clock back a little bit, right, and almost sort of revitalize Sikhi that had possibly been lost during the Khalsa Raj, right, or Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Raj, right, and it was just that sort of reformist zeal, right, that resulted in a group of Singhs getting together, right, and basically, doing, as Jujhar Singh said, right, just doing Kirtan, Akhand parts, and starting to, I think, vitally and crucially important, actually start to deep dive, and I'm going to continue to make this point through this discussion, the deep dive into Gurbani, right, the deep dive into actually really getting to the essence of Gurbani, right, and but it was never started as something as we're going to start something big and new here, right, that is going to stand above everybody else and different. It's just another group of people within the Panth who thought, let's try and shake things up and make a difference here, right, where a lot of what was Sikhi has potentially been lost in the past, right, and it was fairly small, right, at that time, but I would say that the modus operandi of these guys was not, they didn't create a dira. They didn't say, we're going to create a sort of a hub in Narangwal where Bhai Sahibs Pind was, right, and basically everybody get to Narangwal and we're going to do programs there. It was more, we're going to go out to the people, right, and I think that was probably an appreciation as well, right, that look, everybody needs this bhojan, this food of Kirtan, right? We need to go out and effectively distribute this to everybody, right? And that way of sort of operating as a Jatha, as opposed to creating some sort of a base, is probably one of the reasons why Jatha ultimately spread quite quickly, right? In the first instance within India, but also very quickly, from the sort of early mid-70s onward, started to internationally develop into what it is now, probably one of the largest global sansthaas, where even in the UK we've got, in a lot of instances, 4 generations of a Jatha family, right, within the UK, right, and all that has happened through this whole approach to going out to the Sangat, basically, right, going out to Sangat, presenting them with this new way of possibly listening to Kirtan, enjoying Kirtan, and actually participating in the Kirtan, right? Moving away from they're the performers and I'm the audience model of Appa Saryan baith ke ikkathe ne Kirtan karna, and anybody who wants to do Kirtan, come forward. Kids, please come forward and learn Kirtan. We're here for 3 days. You want to learn Kirtan, right? I specifically remember from my younger days, once Bhai Jujhar Singh came to Bradford, where I used to live at the time. They were there for a week, and on the first day they announced, just kisi bacche ne bhi shabad sikhna hai, you want to learn a shabad, please come afterwards, right, and we'll, whilst I'm here for 5 days, I will teach you shabds. By the third day, nobody had come forward, and Bhai Sahib was quite upset, right, that, I really want to teach some children Kirtan, right? And nobody's come forward to learn any Shabads, right? But that was the thing, right? It was basically as much as we can, जिन्ना भी वंड के छक सकते हैं अपन, right? इस चीज़ नू वंड के छकिए, right? And basically, we're not attaching anybody to our appearance or the way we look or anything like that. We're attaching people with the Shabad, right? As a Guru the Nal Jorna through the Shabad, basically, right? And I think that was the beauty of it, right?
So this is during the British Raj in India, Hannah, and at this time, around 1900, 1905, Bhai Sahib is working as in government service, and he's sent to a place called Abbottabad, which is now in Pakistan.
Yep.
And that's a really key place in Bhai Sahibs Jeevan. That's where he had darshan of Guru Sahib, and that's also where he directly, through divine intervention, received Gurmantar from Guru Sahib, as he tells in his Jail Chittiyan.
Anji.
And during that time, he had started doing Akhand parts and listening to Akhand parts in one chonkri. And the amount of nand he got from that, I don't think I can describe it, but even words don't do justice in his. That's only, Gurbani says, "Gunge ki mathiyai." You can only taste the experience that you're experiencing. So Bhai Sahib had decided that he wasn't really interested in working or any worldly attachments, and he just wanted to, get the Anand of Gurbani through Akhand parts and focus on that and build his connection with Guru Sahib. And so he decided to quit his job and go back home to Narangwal. And on the way home, he stopped off at a place called Haripur, and he wanted to do darshan of Bibi Gulab Kaur, who was a Brahmgyani.
Was she quite well known at that time?
I think within the locality she was, and a lot of people. So Bibi Gulab Kaur was a Brahmgyani, as was her husband. So Donne ji, we talk about ek jot doi murti. They were described as very close, and their spiritual status was very elevated. And suddenly, Bibi ji's husband passed away, and I think from that moment on, the relationship she had with her husband, she diverted to Guru Sahib, and her sole focus was on that connection with Guru Sahib, and she didn't care for any. She was described as a wanderer who just wandered around, but in anand and bliss, but also wouldn't communicate or be sociable with anyone. So for that reason, when Bhai Sahib wanted to see her, the local Sangat said, "I don't think that's a good idea, because she doesn't really entertain anyone. She doesn't want to see anyone.
Yeah.
If anyone comes near her, she'll throw stones at them."
Oh, right.
Yeah, so she, it's really like that. So, but Bhai Sahib was insistent, she's Brahmgyani and I want to do darshan of her. So then the Sangat took him towards where she was, and from a distance said, there she is, tusi jaake darshan kar lo. And so Bhai Sahib approached her slowly, and I think some Sangat who with her tried to track back, and but as soon as Bhai Sahib got near her, she suddenly just got up from her samadhi or whatever she was sitting down, I think at the time, and acknowledged, and Bhai Sahib with Fateh welcomed him. Was about to take a shawl off for Bhai Sahib to put on the floor so he could sit,
right.
But he said, "Nahi, I'm not worthy of that." And then they had some vichar, and it was her who I think had given blessings to Bhai Sahib to go and do prachar of Akhand parts and so forth. So you could, in a way, saying the blessings, for the Jatha as it is today, came from Bibi Gulab Kaur through Bhai Sahib.
Wow. And this is obviously all very detailed documented in Bhai Sahib's book, right?
So the story I described is written in Bhai Sahib's Jail Chittiyan. So essentially this is letters from jail when Bhai Sahib was in jail from 1915 to 1931. And this is a compilation of letters that he had written to Gyani Nar Singh, who then compiled it into a book. It's also been translated into to an English version, which is known as his autobiography. And just to touch on sort of the reason he was in jail was for his role in the Gadar Lair. So when the British were in India, there was a movement to obviously free, India or Punjab at that time from British rule. And his involvement in that, and also there was one particular incident where the British were going to demolish the wall of Rakabganj Gurdwara, which is a Itihasik Gurdwara in Delhi, to sort of to beautify and sort of make the parliament, which is right next to Rakabganj Sahib Gurdwara, even bigger. So when Bhai Sahib heard about this, he was very upset, because obviously it's this Itihasik Asthan for Sikh, the Sikh Panth, and he was going to take a Jatha of 500 to actually go and protest against that. So they didn't end up doing it in the end, but
Right.
and
They captured him before he could continue with the protest.
that was one of the key moments. But also his role in the Gadar Lair, which is a whole nother topic.
Sure.
But
Yeah,
we can maybe touch on it later.
Sure.
There's the actual incident, or the case, if you like, was known as the Lahore conspiracy, the second Lahore conspiracy case. There was two Lahore conspiracy cases, and the one Bhai Sahib was arrested in was the second Lahore conspiracy case, which is quite detailed in the book.
Yeah, in the book. Yeah.
The one thing I would just say about the book, the English translation has a good 50 pages maybe at the beginning, which is actually just the translator's sort of a historical account of Bhai Sahib's life right from beginning to they obviously were with there. I think actually Dr. Talon Singh was at Bhai Sahib's bedside when they passed away as well, if I recall correctly. But they basically have written a good overview of Bhai Sahib's life in the English translation. So anybody interested in learning more, highly recommended read the intro in the English version.
And so Bhai Sahib Ji gets the blessings from Bibi Gulab Kaur Ji, and then they go, as you said before, village to then do prachar through the method of Akhand Paths, and then obviously subsequently Kirtan. What is a Ranspai?
So Ranspai is typically, as you would see it nowadays, is a Kirtan all night. So it runs through from the evening to early Amrit Vela morning. And so in Bhai Sahib's times, it wasn't a scheduled program as you see nowadays. Now, you have a Samagam where you have a Ranspai. But in those days, and from, I guess, where the Ranspai tradition got more popular, was, as I mentioned earlier, the Akhand part of the Pog of the Akhand part, Asa Diwar would start. Bhai Sahib would have no care about time, because every moment of connection with the Vaheguru was so important to them that time was an issue. There was one instant actually where one of the Puratan Singhs were telling me that there was a kirtan going on, and I think either one had to go to work, or for some reason they had to finish or something, or maybe go on from where they were, and there was a little clock there, and he turned it towards Bhai Sahib. And Bhai Sahib looked at it and turned it back. Just to say, I don't really care. We're in a Nand here, right? Any time which was spent listening, doing Kirtan, Akhand parts was, you can't, there's no better thing to do at that point, right? Yeah. So it was their Moj, and I think that's how Ranswais got prachalat and more popular.
Yeah, I guess one thing you probably would have seen back then as well, I guess in contrast to what perhaps we see today, is the Sangat, because the Juri Hoi see, they probably sit for a very, very long time, Whereas now, I guess maybe, I attend obviously for the first recording and obviously before that, but you don't really see the the Divan hall fully packed out in most of the smugglers. Some of them like Derby, you'll see that, but I don't know, is our I don't know if this is a bit of a tangent, maybe I shouldn't say this, but like, is our resilience to be able to sit down in a jonki, is that being reduced?
Hearing about the experiences of you know, the Gursikhs that were there at the time, and there was definitely a difference from today and what it was then. I mean, there's Bibi Harban's Kaur, who we interviewed she's in Chandigarh, and you know, she described it very well. You know, that Bhai Sahib, I think she sang a shabad while we were interviewing her. Emanure rangare, tu sacha rang charaye. And she said that Bhai Sahib would repeat this line so many times. Or सारे नु रंग चाड़ के फिर they would move on, right? So the energy in that room was different. The way that we understand from first-hand accounts, and now we've not experienced it, but the energy was just something else. And maybe it was because Bhai Sahib's kamai, or the kamai of the Singhs that were sitting there, or the energy there, or Guru Sahib's kirpa, you know. But it was definitely something which we wish we would have experienced.
100%.
Gyaniji often made this point, and
Gyani Mullik Singh Ji?
Yeah.
Achha.
And I remember being there once they said this, right? It was a really simple phrase. He said, "Jithe koi baitha siga, uthe baithe rehndhe se," right? Basically meaning, you know, you went to the Kirtan, you sat down, and that was it, right? You just sat where you were sat. And he was going on to make the point that basically there wasn't a case of now X is doing Kirtan, right, and I'm going to go and sit with them because that's my guy, right, type of thing, right? And then, you know, on this person is doing Kirtan who I don't particularly appreciate, so I'll go out now for a bit, right, and socialize for a bit, and that type of thing. There was none of that. He said, Gyaniji used this word, and maybe later on we can talk a little bit about this, but his exact words were, "Udon koi fanism hai nahi," right? There was no, you weren't the fan of anyone, right? You just sat where you sat. The only thing you were a fan of was Kirtan and not individuals.
I remember hearing that actually.
Gyaniji
saying that,
it was done at a Toronto Smagam, if I remember correctly.
Yes,
right? I might be wrong. But.
So Riji, you've mentioned that actually during that time, this is like the mahal of the actual the environment of the smagams. Can we go into a bit more detail? So can you just describe like what was it like to be in like one of those original smagams where Bhai Sahib Ji would be doing Kirtan, or like other Singhs would be doing Kirtan as well?
I wish I could. I don't think I can do justice to explain that. But I guess the example that I shared with you earlier around, you know, Bibi Harban's score, how she explained how, you know, the energy in that environment was so intense, and so anandamay, in bliss, Hana, and that sort of theme resonates through all the interviews that we did, and that, you know, the way that Kirtan was, it was something else. People, like, you know, Baji described that people didn't get up from there, not because they were scared or they didn't, you know, they didn't want to. It was, there was nothing better to do at that time, and that was that was the place to be. That was Sachkhand. And
I think the story that Jujhar Singh's related, every sort of Siani Purani Singh that we've spoke to have probably related the same story. And probably lots of different shabads. Another famous tuk is Janam Janam Ka Bichda, right? Har mein lo sajjan sain. Usse cheez nu, to sing it for like 30 minutes maybe, right? Just the same tuk, right? Like whilst crying, right? You know, tears flowing through your eyes and just singing that tuk, right? For 20, 30 minutes. I think we'll never get to that stage, right? The Gurbani will literally pierces in that way, right? You know, and it wasn't just the person singing, it wasn't just Bhai Sahib, right? Everybody who was sat there all felt that, right? And my Master Ji, the the Master Ji said that they only actually did Bhai Sahib Darshan once, I think, right? They went to one Kirtan where an associate of Master Ji's took them to that Kirtan, and they said that basically all night, you know, I was wandering around on different planes, basically. That was the exact words they used. In Punjabi, they said, "Kadi uppar, main kadi uppar sega, kadi thalle sega." Right? I was just sort of all over the place, right? You know, that was their description of that, right? And I see, sometimes it's upsetting to think how far away we are possibly from that vibe, right? Right? And I've always been a firm believer, certainly in terms of jo minu like siane to sikhਣ ਨੂੰ ਮਿਲਿਆ, right? That each book has a philosophy in itself, right? ਜਾਣੀ ਕਿ ਉਹਨੂੰ ਜੇ ਉਹ ਇੱਕ ਚੀਜ਼ ਉਹ ਇੱਕ ਤੁਕ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਹਿਰਦੇ ਚ ਵਸ ਜਾਵੇ, right? It is sufficient to turn your entire life around, right? And that was kind of almost the approach that they took, right? We're not reeling off Shabbat after Shabbat after Shabbat, right? We are gonna almost get to the very, very core essence, right, of this thing that we are reading just now.
Yeah, and that's why you see, when Kirtan's done in the Jatha, it's very themed. So they'll use different tuks or different shabads which are related to the same theme to sort of echo that message.
Narrate the story of like the theme of that,
a lot of the listeners or yourself are probably familiar with Akhand Kirtan, which is a pothi, which has a collection of shabads, and they're all themed, and that actually came from the Jatha. So the Jatha sings.
Oh right. As in the Akhand Kirtan, literally like the right. Okay.
So,
you don't see it nowadays that much because everyone's using apps, right?
Exactly. But the Akhand Kirtan, what came from Singh sitting behind Bhai Sahib or the Kirtani and noting down shabads and putting them into themes. So the whole of Akhand Kirtan is based on
themes,
ardas, benti, whatever, Guru Sahib, and so forth. So you'll see a lot of that. And even in Bhai Sahib's one of his books, Rangle Sajjan, he describes the Kirtan as Lot Poti Kirtan. Lot Pot ho jande. So basically in bliss. In the form of in ecstasy, right. And just so it's hard to describe that
here nor there, basically
losing yourself. It just in Gurbani, in Kirtan, in that sort of connection. And it was like I described. It was the Kirtan was so piercing that it would draw people in. There's an incident of Subedar Harbachan Singh, who was walking past when Bhai Sahib was doing Kirtan. He was an atheist.
Right.
At that point, he was walking past and just hearing the Kirtan, he was so drawn in. He came into the Sangat, sat down, and took Amrit at the next Amrit Sanchar.
Hopefully, people will take something away from this discussion, right? Especially the youngsters. But if I was to say like one thing, it's this theme that we've touched upon now is in many ways at the core of what it means, right? To be Jatha, right? It's essentially what, for me, defines Jatha and defines Jatha Kirtan. That whole thing about the theme thing, right? The one thing I would say, I'm fortunate enough to have sort of, I was 14 at the time when SDO came to the UK, and I listened to the Kirtan in Bradford live, and there was a 3-hour Kirtan there that I still, 40 years later, I still listen to it quite regularly, because it was 3 hours of somebody, like, if we were to use English metaphors, like weaving a tapestry, right? Weaving a tapestry that was almost like so graphical you could picture, right, where this story was going, right? I've had to listen to it time and time again, probably because when I was 14, I didn't have the foggiest what was going on in a lot of it. It just sounded quite nice, right? But starting with a shabad that almost kind of asks a bit of a question as well, right? And SDO Sahib did kind of like a difficult word to understand. They would explain it just to make sure that everybody's following where this theme's heading, right? So the first shabad, Bikmo Bikam Akhada, right? He explains, Bikmo Bikam Akhada, right? The hardest of hardest battles, right, or arenas of battle, right, you will win, right, with the support of the Guru. And then the whole story from there, right, just very quickly goes through talking about sort of how you capture something, right? Almost in a hunting context as well, right? Then it goes into a battle, but a battle that is clearly completely metaphorical for the battle that's going on inside yourself, right? In terms of your mind, right? And which are the cheezaਂ that Guru Sahib has almost given us, right, as the sort of the sort of equipment of war, right, that we can use to then win that battle, right, to get to the end of that, to then talk about basically getting on top of that fort and effectively putting your flag on the top of that fort, that I've conquered it, right? Bhagwat Peer Sakal Simran ki kati kaal pe fasi, Das Kabir chadyo gad upar Raj liyo abnasi, right? It's absolutely moving even now, right, when I think about it. And then ultimately ending that Kirtan with the Shabad Fateh Pai Manjeet, right, as the last Shabad. And I would say up to this day, to anybody listening to this, you want to see the most complete example of an AKJ Kirtan is probably that recording and the one from the week after at Smethwick, right, as a most complete example of what would be Jatha Kirtan. What we have to note there is, right, that this is early 80s that we're talking about now. It was certainly before the days of being able to go on your phone and, type in a particular word and getting a load of shabads that have that word in them and so on, right, or doing any of that type of research. This was all researched from Pothiyan and Sentiyan and so on, and covered material from Guru Granth Sahib, Dasam Granth, by Nand Lal Ji, by Gudas Ji, right? All those different sources, right, were basically covered in these Kirtans, right? And all this research was done by the Singhs, and for them to have all of this front of mind in terms of where to go to source all this stuff, right, is actually also really important to understand, and probably a big sort of a distinguishing factor in terms of Jatha, right? That, they could comfortably sit for 3 hours, right, and sing all these shabads that were completely linked and related, right, to be able to tell that story as a tapestry, right? It was hilarious that one of the times when I put that video on, right, and people were there singing, and my daughter said, "Where's the projector?" Right? I said, there was no projector in them. She said, "So how did they know what to sing then? Right? How do people know what was being sung and stuff like that?" So it was before all of that, right? And I think that's an important thing for youngsters to take away, right? That people were sitting there basically labouring over the Sentiyan, the different resources that they had at their disposal, right, to basically create these themes from Gurbani, basically.
I guess actually to that point where Sangat obviously is singing, I say this from my personal perspective as well, like there's a difference between listening and actually like listening, like, picking out like the very subtleties in some of the words within the Shabad. Sometimes it's very easy to just suddenly think of a different word which sounds very similar, but it has a completely different contextual meaning.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
like for some, I'm sure there would have been members of Sangat at that time, and even now, that when they're listening to Kirtan, they obviously listen very intently so that they pick up every single, a word in the Shabad. So that's a really interesting point, actually, Vijay.
I think the focus was Gurbani always.
That's it.
And I think today we've become a bit lazy because of the technology we have, right?
Yeah.
Like what you said, it's so easy to pick a few shabads with a certain
this is
theme
without
or
AI
certain,
yet as
yeah, exactly. But in those days, doing Khoj wasn't that easy. Gurbani says, "Har par, har lik, har gao, har sun." I don't think anyone hardly writes Gurbani anymore. I remember when I started, doing Kirtan back in my sort of teens, I used to write shabads. I've probably got my boti somewhere where I used to write shabads. But nowadays we don't, because it's so easy. And
you just favorite it in your app, isn't it?
Yeah, we've become, that mentality has shifted a little bit. So sometimes we need to bring back to basics.
There's another point, if I may.
Sure.
Of
course.
Right. It's, and this is a general point for the whole Panth to sort of reflect upon. Right, is a point that's constantly sort of plaguing my mind. You could argue that I should actually get up and do something about it, maybe, if that's the case. But the going back to the technology and the projector and the fact that we now have a translation as well, right? It is for somebody like myself who grew up in the 70s and probably is more bilingual than maybe some of the later generations, right? I can say hand on heart that the English translation at times is so far off the mark, it's unbelievable. And if you took a Shabbat and looked at what Professor Sahib Singh translated it as compared to what the English translation is, it's almost laughable, right? How the English translation has been, it's been a literal translation of some poetry, right? If we say Gurbani is poetic, right, it's been a literal translation of poetry by clearly a non-English speaking person as well, right? So the actual, sometimes the actual English, like the sentence structure isn't great, the grammar isn't great, but equally the entire essence of actually what the Shabad is about has been totally missed, right? And, you know, if you hold those two things side by side, it's sometimes quite upsetting to see that this is what we are now exposing the younger generation to. And I would say, as a Panth, there needs to be, somebody did mention to me that somebody's doing this Seva, but there needs to be a team come together to effectively do the actual translation into English of Professor Sahib Singh's Tika, and it be done by English speakers who can cope with the Punjabi and not the other way around, right? It's a massive gap, right? I think in our prachar at the moment that needs to be addressed, but it's also a huge undertaking.
So what do you see the role of Akhand Kirtan Jatha in the Panth?
I think the first and most central point here is Jatha is not separate from Panth. It's not a Panth in itself, right? It is very much what I would say in Punjabi, an ang of the Panth, right? It is very much part and parcel, right? A part of the Panth as a whole, 100% aligned to Akhand, right? And absolutely accepting of Akhand as a supreme authority of the Panth, right? The Jatha doesn't, certainly we don't publish anything like our own Rat Maryada or anything like that. And as a bare minimum, we recognize the same Maryada the rest of the Panth recognizes, right? And I think it's really vital to make that point, right? It's too often, you know, particularly in younger generations, unfortunately, you know, people start to create unnecessary barriers that don't actually exist in reality, right? And certainly when you look at Jatha, we've been fortunate to have spoken to some of the elders or people who were around, let's say, in a pre-84 era. I do think there's a bit of a pre- and post-84 issue here as well, right, in terms of how the direction the Panth has gone in, right, and largely as a result of the meddling of external forces, I would argue, right. But when you speak to the elders who tell you how it was in the 60s and the 70s and so on, the Jatha was just another sort of respected sanstha within the Panth, just as the Taksal might be or anybody else might be. And just on that specific point, actually, about the Taksal and Jatha, you hear a lot now about the relationship between Taksal and Jatha and so on, that maybe there's some issue there or something like that. Jatha and Taksal were extremely, extremely appreciative and respecting of each other, right? And when you hear the stories from the Singhs of old, right, the Taksal, whenever they had any large Akart or programs, would always ensure that Jatha got sort of pride of place in terms of coming there to do Kirtan, or if there was going to be a Nagar Kirtan or anything, right, the Jatha would be the ones that would get the upstairs front seats, basically on a truck, let's say, to do Kirtan, right, or something like that. Not, you know, that was the respect that existed between the two organizations, right, because they were both fundamentally built on the premise of sort of, you know, some sort of that Gurmat, you know, Reni Bani, right, and there was that Satkar as a result, right, for each other. Sadly, I would say in a post-84 world, there has been outside elements that have come in the form of like Gursikhs, right? That I would argue have done a pretty good job of trying to create barriers, right, and create issues, right? But there is never ever been a case that somehow Jatha is separate from the Panth, above the Panth, right, or better than everybody else in the Panth as well, equally, right? You know, I think TK, there's, as I mentioned in an earlier point, it is like a number of other organizations, a reformist body. It was a reformist body in that post 1850s era of when politically Sikhs were extremely powerful, but spiritually we'd probably lost our way a little bit, right? It's a reformist movement like many other reformist movements during that time. And as a reformist movement, the one thing I would say is that in Jatha, the focus on Naam and Bani, right, has been core and central, right, to everything else, right? But equally, right, you'd be hugely misguided if, as a, let's say, somebody who does Sangat in Jatha, to suggest that nobody else does Simran or nobody else has a Amrit Vela routine like Jatha has, right? We don't publish, like I said, our own Ret Maryada, but we only have to pick up the Panthic Ret Maryada, the Akal Takht Wali Maryada, as we sometimes call it, right? Ode which, what's the first thing said on the first page of that, right? In terms of your daily conduct, is that in the last quarter of the night, you must, a Gursikh must do their Simran Abhiyaas, right? And that's the accepted Panthic position, right? You know, so you know, this whole sort of what essentially is the core concept, right, of Sikhi, of Gurmat, right? I think we've already talked about SDO Sahib earlier. One of the things, you know, that rings in my mind from a Kirtan where they said, we Amrit Shakran da matlab ye hai Guru to naam lena, right? And I think that if you want to talk about little differentiators or something, from a very young age, that was drilled into us, right? The whole point of taking Amrit is to get the Gurmantar from your Guru and the methodology for doing Abhiyaas of that Gurmantar, right? And you could ask questions about your further spiritual journey, or go back later and ask questions about your further spiritual journey around that, right? But that's the core premise of it, right? But just to finish off, I guess, is that, you know, we are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Panth, right?
Yeah.
In corporate language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. So I guess in essence, what we're saying is that Akhand Kirtan smagams or functions or programs are essentially Sanja. It's for everybody, right?
Absolutely. The Panthic programs, and that's demonstrated by the fact that in India especially, right, if you look at the main smagams that happen in India and where they happen at central Panthic sthans, right, such as Manji Sahib Diwan Hall in Amritsar, ਜਿਹੜਾ ਰਕਾਬਗੰਜ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ hall ਹੈ, the Diwan Hall attached to Rakabganj Sahib in Delhi, right? You know, two of the biggest samagams that happen in the year, right? Happen, and like the Delhi Akhand Kirtan Samagam happens with the full support of the Delhi Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, right? So it's not some separate thing that goes on, right? And it's never ever been different, you know, from that, right? And Bhai Sahib's position on this was quite clear, and I think it's recognised. Jujar Singh, you want to talk about Bhai Sahib's position in the Panth and how they were recognised in the Panth, I guess, you know, would give you a good example.
Yeah, no, agree with what Bhaji's said that there. I think, you know, from Bhai Sahib's times, that there was no intention to create a Jathebandi. It evolved over time. Like we said before, it started off as a Ishq for Kirtan and sharing that through Prachar. Through Bhai Sahib's life, he was always samarpat to Akal Takht, and following when he came out of jail in 1931, he was adorned with Suropas from, you know, various gurdware, but most importantly, the 4 takhts at the time. Damdama Sahib was created as a takht later, but one of the few individuals, I guess, of the last century who have received Saropai or robes of honor from all 4 takhts, which shows you their contribution to the Panth. And even when he was in jail, and if you read the jail chittiyan, this is more detailed in there about the Gurbani he gave in there and how he would need to, fast for days and weeks because they weren't getting their rights. Obviously, he was Babeki, so he wouldn't eat from non-amritaris. He would like to make his own food and etc. So he would have to fast for 40 days. He was tortured during that time. And when the Panth got to know about it, I think on the 1st of February 1923, I believe, there was a ardas held by the whole Panth for Bhai Sahib because of his Gurbani that he, in jail when they found out the torture and atrocities that were being done at the time by the British. So that just shows. And then following that, Bhai Sahib's, he through his writings, but also experiences told by his sathis, Bhai Sahib would engage with, other Panthic personalities of all various Jathebandiyan. Akali Kaur Singh, who's from Naam Jathebandi, Baba Gurbachan Singh. Baba Gurbachan Singh's even written a poem on Bhai Sahib, on his Gurbani, on his love for Kirtan.
Yeah.
And so there wasn't these factions that sometimes we see nowadays. It was pure pyar and love because of Gurbani, because of Guru Sahib, because satkar of each other.
Yeah.
So there weren't these differences in those days.
And I think that, just sort of moving away from Bhai Sahib to other sort of respected things within Jatha that we've seen, right? Actually, Gyani Mulk Singh Ji is a great example, right, of somebody who certainly didn't sort of pin their colours to any mast even, right? They did Seva wherever they felt like doing Seva, wherever they felt there was a need for Seva, right? But similarly, there's lots of other examples of Jatha Singhs, where we, like any major project or undertaking that the Panth was doing at a Panthic level, it would not be unheard of to have one of the Panch Singhs who was laying the foundation for such a project to be a Jatha Singh, right? You could take by Joginder Singh Tarwaraji's example of, the Panth had given them that duty and seva of proofreading Guru Granth Sahib's Roops, right? So they were doing that seva on behalf of the Panth, right? So there's never been anything like that, and I think it's a sad sort of situation that we find ourselves in now, where there is unnecessarily barriers being created. I think it's interesting also, I mean, I've been quite vocal to suggest that this has been done by sort of bad actors or elements that are probably anti-Panthic in their search, right? You can actually look at the UK and then go to, let's say, Vancouver or somewhere like that, and find that in Vancouver, they don't have the same sort of issues that perhaps we've got in the UK even, right? I don't know whether that's as a result of UK was specifically targeted because there were more Sangat here in the early days, right? But, it is something worthwhile looking at as well.
Yeah,
it's an interesting point.
And just to add, so just going back on the point of, of Jatha Singhs being involved in Panthic Karj. So when Bhai Sahib came out of jail, he was a Jathedar of the Panj who laid the foundation stone of Sri Panja Sahib in Pakistan now.
Yeah.
And we actually discovered photos where we can see Bhai Sahib and the Panj Singh.
Wonderful.
Obviously, if you go to Panja Sahib, you can see the plaque which names Bhai Sahib, Sant Fasaka Singh, and all the other Singhs in the Panj at that point. So that, and also at one point offered to become the Jathedar of Akal Takht Sahib, which he politely refused.
All right. Okay.
But so this just shows that there was no separation from the Panth from a Jatha perspective, and never has been.
Very much Gur Sikho Eko Pyar, like just,
absolutely. There was a common thread through everybody there, right? and it'd be really nice to see more of that.
It's a Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj that keeps us all together, because at the end of the day, that's our Guru, isn't it? So yeah, interesting. So so can you just touch upon the role of Akhand Kirtan Jatha in the 80s, around the time of the Sangarsh? Obviously, it's an ongoing Sangarsh, but in terms of like the Shaheed Singhs and Singhniya at the time, what was the mahal like at the time? What was the Jathebandi like at the time? And obviously, I guess to that point, the ekta that we had, you know, as Jatha and, you know, alongside other Jathebandiyan.
Anji, so the events of 1980 obviously are, you know, fresh in our mind because of the 40th year anniversary now. The events of the early 80s and beyond sort of predate the 80s a little bit and go back to 78, where there was Amritsar Saka, where during Amritsar Jatha Samagam, actually, the days of Vaisakhi in 1978, there was a confrontation between the Panth and non-Panthic entities at the time. And during that time, you'll see, you know, that there's photographic evidence, eyewitnesses from that time who will tell stories, who are still here today with us. You know, what that ikta was like. There was no you and us. It was almost together, Hannah. Even to the extent that, you know, in the photographs you see Sangat Singh Ji, you know, attending the funeral of the Tera Singh, they got Shaheed, comforting, you know, all the parwars and sort of Shaheed parwars that had been involved in there, and supporting the whole sort of that whole sort of scenario, and then going into the Dharam Yudh Morcha, and then the events of 84. So there was no separation. I mean, you know, between Jatha, Tuksal, Hang Jathebandiyan, everyone was together, and it was for you know, one cause.
Yeah. And just to be clear, that the Shaheed were not all Jatha Singhs. You know, right? It's an important distinction to draw, right? Just in case that impression's given. But I mean, it's interesting again looking at the sort of UK picture at the time, right? That there wasn't. Jatha was the biggest sanstha in the UK probably at the time, right? I mean, you obviously saw Road, Nishkam Sevak Jatha existed at the time. There were a couple of other, I would say, sort of like Amritari groups, if you like, right? But Jatha was probably by far the biggest sort of Panthic entity in the UK. And in that time, the prachar of, if we say prachar as in the distribution of Sanjanel Singh's lectures, right, and so on, was largely driven by Jatha Singhs doing those recordings and distributing those tapes at the time. You know, I can remember specifically you know, seeing Jatha Singh sat there doing these recordings of Sanjanel Singh's lectures, as well as like Tadi Baran from Jiri Nabbe Waliyan Bibiyan Singiyan and stuff like that. You know, a lot of that stuff was all distributed by Jatha, right? But I think the key here, right? Just handing back to Jujhar Singh, I guess really the roots of all this are in Bhai Sahib's sort of attitude, if you like, in terms of, you know, standing up as a voice for the Panth, right? Which then led to 78 and then everything that happened obviously post 78.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes back to, you know, the whole theology of Bhai Sahib, which was Sant Sebai. You know, he stood up for what he thought, in a Gurmat perspective, was the right thing to do. The Rakabganj Morcha, the Gadar Lair, and any other Panthic carriages. So it wasn't just focused on, you know, your spirituality. The whole concept of a Gursikh is a balance of those two. If you have more, you know, Sipai, warrior in you, then less spirituality, then you can see what's happening all over the world now, you know, injustice. But if you have that Gamai spirituality, then you will always balance those two and have that Daya and Dharam within you.
So there's an interesting little anecdote here in terms of, like, obviously, like the other things that were there at the time, you know, on the ground, if you like, in Darbar Sahib, there was obviously a strong presence of Jatha Singhs as well. And there was an interesting story recounted, you know, when we think about the Jatha sort of respect in the Panth and so on, by Nirmal Singh, Khalsa, Hajuri Ragi, the ones that passed away during COVID, right? The Chacha Ji of अपने इथे अपने Birmingham वाले Karanjit Singh Kirtani, right?
Oh, right. Okay.
It's their Chacha Ji, and they basically were in Darbar Sahib and were effectively rescued from Darbar Sahib by a group of Jatha Singhs, right? And Bhai Sahib often recounted that story in terms of the respect that they had for Jatha Singhs. And they did Kirtan Utte Amritsar Samagam, they bhi Kirtan karte rahe, right? I think, in fact, they might have done it in Australia as well one year when they went to Australia, maybe. Or was that Narendra Singh? I can't remember. One of the Amritsar Ragis, you know, did Kirtan at Australia song because Bhai Mulk Singh Ji is there and stuff as well, right? But it's just another example, right, of the sort of the links and respect, right, between Jatha. And you saw recently Guru Har Rai Sahib Karanjit came there and did Kirtan, right, as well.
I'd like to start talking about the musicality and the, you know, I guess hand in hand with the spirituality aspect of Akhand Kirtan specifically. So as part of this podcast, obviously this podcast is being recorded in June. We're obviously remembering 84 for Jali Saal, 40 years now. And this podcast will be releasing hopefully on the birth anniversary of Bhai Sahib Randhir Singh. And one thing that I've wanted to do, like from a Kirtan 5 perspective, is to kind of show what Jatha Kirtan used to be like, and obviously hence the question about Bhai Sahib Ji's recordings, which hopefully one day we will have access to at some point, if it exists. But as a part of this podcast, we've also released a series of albums in collaboration with Aisa Kirtan. And those albums focus on Bhai Mohinder Singh Ji SDO, which you mentioned before, Bhai Meher Singh Ji, Bhai Joginder Singh Ji Talwara, and Bhai Jeevan Singh Ji as well. And so the purpose of those, Sangat Ji, is to go listen to those, and hopefully you'll get a vibe of, if you haven't before, you'll be able to get a vibe of what kind of older Kirtan, Jatha Kirtan used to sound like. And I guess a lot of the Rita, and you'll probably touch on this again, Kamaljt Singh Ji, in a bit, is that some of the Rita that are played in terms of the musicality in those shabads actually dates back to how Bhai Sahib Ji would have most likely have done Kirtan. And then in contrast, we've got modern recordings, again, it's kind of more official, Akhand Kirtan Jatha Samagams being Derby, and specifically 2022 and 2023, which you can listen to on the Kirtan 5 platform. So what would you describe the musicality of Akhand Kirtan like? Because it's not like mainstream Ragi Kirtan, but it's kind of, obviously it has its own distinct style. And I think we'll certainly talk about how that style obviously is now becoming a lot more widestream, even amongst Ragis actually, to that extent. But yeah, if we can just start with that first, if you could comment on that.
Sure. I think I'm going to start again just sort of with a more of a point of clarification than anything else. That we have to be absolutely clear that the Jatha hasn't got some sort of a sort of anti-Raag stance, right? That we don't appreciate Raag. And, you know, I'm not just saying that off my own back, right? To make ourselves sound politically correct or something. The Kirtani that you've mentioned, right? From there, if you take Bhai Meher Singh, Bhai Jeevan Singh, right? As well as that, we think about Gyani Mulk Singh Ji, 3 Puratan Kirtani from a Jatha perspective. All 3 were professionally trained Ragis, right? Bhai Jeevan Singh Ji did Hazuri Ragi Seva for 20 years nearly at Patna Sahib, right? Bhai Meher Singh was a classically trained Ragi, and Gyani Ji, I'd like to think, is probably the one that we all know better than most, did Tabla Di Seva in Jatha as well, right? But was a Ragi of respect as well, right? So that in itself should make the point clear that there's certainly not some sort of an anti-rag agenda here, right? And we can bring that up to the modern time. From the old days, if we think of like Bibiyan's Kirtan, Bibi Bhupinder Kaur Ji, who we often refer to as Poop Ji, had an MA in music, right? They had an MA in music and did a lot of Rag Kirtan as well, right? And they were the wife of Puran Ji, Bhai Surat Singh Ji, who were the Jathedar of Panchpare for a long time and Jathedar of AKJ worldwide for quite some time as well, right? And you can bring that to the modern day now and look at the, and I'm just picking out examples of people that immediately spring to mind. Obviously, Gyani Gudev Singh, right? Classically trained Ragi, right? Parminder Singh, Australia, right? Classically trained, who you recently interviewed, I think, right?
We did a podcast.
For this podcast as well, right? And similarly, you could think of people like Gurpreet Banerjee in California, right? Had an MA in music as well, right? Indeed, has an MA in music. I shouldn't talk in the past tense, right? About somebody from my generation, right? So there is absolutely not an issue with that, right? But you can argue that there is a Kirtan style, right, that's different. And you talk about mainstream ragis, there's another conversation to be had here about how many mainstream ragis actually stick to the Pratan Kirtan Parampara, if you like, the sort of Kirtan Parampara of the Rababis and so on. Not that many, actually, and a lot of that has become sort of almost like a ghazal style, sort of, soft, semi-classical stroke folk music type of Kirtan anyway, right? I think the key distinction within the Jatha goes back to some of the earlier points that we made, right? Which is that it was more from a position of, the Kirtan was from a position of Prema Bhakti and Sangati Roop Kirtan, right? So we're talking more group singing, right? And also very much that sort of loving devotion being the sort of core emotion that's evoked within the Kirtan, right? And you could draw some parallels with like the Sufi style singing, right? The Qawwali singing even, right? Could be a parallel that you could draw within that. And within that, you mentioned the Rita Bhai Sahib. There are two recordings of whereby Mir Singh has basically just compiled a lot of the Rita or tunes that Bhai Randhir Singh sang. And they were tunes that weren't specific to Bhai Randhir Singh or specific to Jatha. I think if you searched around for Kirtan in that era, you would find them sang in lots of different places by lots of different people, right? There weren't something unique, right? But there was a style to it. And I think, the crux of all of this goes back to the earlier point about using it as a vehicle to absolutely get attuned with the Shabad, right? The other extreme of that is to get so engrossed in a rag that you can't even understand what somebody's saying, right? As the other extreme example of that, right? And then there's a happy medium somewhere in the middle. But in terms of Jatha Kirtan, it's very much about using a tune to actually allow the Shabad to pierce yourself as the Kirtani, but every other person who effectively are all at that time trying to in unison be a Kirtani, if you like, right? All singing in unison as Kirtanis.
If I may play devil's advocate, so I've done a few of these podcasts and actually some of them haven't been released yet, but there is respect for the fact that, I guess the question comes down to like, what is Kirtan? I guess the question then also becomes is, Guru Sahib Ji's obviously written Shabads in Raag, prescribed in Raag. And there'll be many a time when, even in this podcast, probably subsequently after this episode releases, there will undoubtedly be Kirtanis who will say that you should always read the Shabad in that prescribed Raag. Others will say it's okay, you can, there's no specific rule that you can't do it in that rag, because obviously there's like Mishrat rags as well, and you can like mix rags and do different things musically in that sense. I guess the question then is like, if you're trying to jod with the Shabad, then why would you not sing it in the rag that's been prescribed?
It's a fairly valid question, right? And let's see where it takes us, I guess, right? I mean, if you want to be absolutely on the nail, right, in terms of sort of what we might say is the correct parampara or approach, then that would be absolutely the argument, right? But then you have to take that argument further in terms of there is rag specification, but then there is also different types of melodies specified, i.e., Asaibar Tunde Gituni should be the only actual composition, right, musical composition that you should use to read Lapodia, right, in Asaibar. But similarly, forgive me if I get this wrong, I think Ganare Divar is in like Muse di Tuni, if I remember correctly, right? But and that's another separate whole different tune, right? And certainly I know there are people out there that have actually gone through all the Vara where there have been references to Tunya and they've compiled those Tunya, right? But it goes down a whole line. And I think the key point I would make is I am certainly, and a lot of this might be my own personal view as well, right? I'm not opposed to any of that, and actually a huge advocate that the Panth as a collective should take steps towards revitalizing and retaining that tradition, right? Sort of rejuvenating that tradition, right, as we go forward.
Yeah.
Right? And I would be a very strong advocate for that, right? But equally, I could argue the counter, which is that basically in the days of old, and again, this is from speaking to elder Gursikhs, they would say that there was never a Raggi who ever criticized the Jatha for the way they did Kirtan. And the reason for that was they appreciated that this is a whole different thing that's going on here, right? These people have, going back to that term, done an absolute deep dive into Gurbani, right? They have really researched this subject matter that this individual is now going to do Kirtan on. They've researched it to its absolute nth sort of degree, right? And compiled a set of shabds on that basis. And this individual is now singing those shabds in such a way that he or she is moved at their core, right? Through singing those shabds, right? And as a result of that, they will not then want to go there and question that individual to say, you're not singing in rag, as an example. Right?
I guess the essence is to connect with the Gurbani, right? And if you can connect through it, I mean, counter to this, I guess, like I was saying, I was playing devil's advocate to that question. But like for me, like if somebody was asked, like, what is the definition of Kirtan? Like for me, it's like, well, okay, like if you're in the shower and a pankti comes into your head and you start singing it, tutti frutti, like, vocals as I would anyway, because I can't sing for anything. So like, if I was like singing that pankti, but it's not in the rag as prescribed, is that not Kirtan? Like if like your mind is Jujar and you got that prema bhakti, as you said before, is that not Kirtan? I don't know.
I was just going to say, so Japji Sahib is not in any rag. Does that mean Does that mean you can't sing it? Does that mean there's no value in doing part just by saying it? Rag has, like you said, rag definitely has a place, and Guru Sahib, has prescribed all shabads in rag, so definitely there's an importance there. And I think certain, all rags, in fact, they invoke emotion, right? But for Jatha, not opposed to rag, like we just said, but it's more the connection of and the focus on Gurbani and the deeper meaning to the Gurbani. And that's kind of, we touched on this a little bit before, but the uniqueness of Jatha, which is maybe not so unique anymore because a lot of people do a similar style.
Yeah.
But if it wasn't popular, then no one would do it, right? As well. So it does attract some kind of.
Well, I think it's a Sangat aspect of it as well.
Vibration.
Sangat can easily follow along if it's a simpler tune, right?
That as well, but also if you
want folk to come along, then you got to sing folk tunes.
Well, that as well. But if you look at Akhand Kirtan programs, they're you got 3-5 raggis on the stage and you're listening to them. Jatha is a different. You'll see mostly either if you're sitting on the floor there's people sitting behind the stage, or if the stage is packed with people sitting in there, and that whole vibration is different. The whole Sangati Roop Kirtan is probably the uniqueness which Jatha has, right? From Ragi style Kirtan.
Yep.
But again, like mentioned before, we had different styles of Kirtan going back to Bhai Sahib's times. Bhai Mehr Singh, Bhai Jeevan Singh, Joginder Singh Ji Talwada, Yani Molak Singh. We listen to all these. They're very different styles.
Yep.
Not the same style at all.
Absolutely.
But they're all did Sangat Kirtan with Bhai Sahib. And back to the point in terms of Bhai Mehr Singh recording those reeds, which are available online. But just listening to the experiences, Bhai Sahib used to sing in very high-pitched
I've heard this. Yeah,
high-pitched voices, which we can only imagine. But yeah, so there's no. I suppose what I'm saying is that the focus is on that Gurbani, and that's why they could sit for so many hours because they're immersed in that Gurbani, rather than focusing on just how this sounds, or the tune that it's being playing on, or the converse that you're getting just by sitting there. You're actually immersed in the Shabad.
There's an interesting point that's just occurred to me about the Ritan. In the Ritan, there is a reed there. I'm not going to sing anything, by the way, so don't panic, right? But there's a reed there, and the Shabad is Prem Tugari Pairi Gobind Man Moya Jio, right? That's the Shabad. It's the same reed by Ragi Bakshi sings as well, right? As an example, so these are, like I said, they're not unique in any way. I think to just really to close out on this, right? We probably need to zoom out at a Panthic level and look at this, right? You Jandeep Singh used the phrase mainstream ragis a number of times, right? Absolutely not criticizing any mainstream ragi in any way whatsoever. They're all way ahead of me in terms of their Gurbani knowledge. But there's an argument to be had. How many of those are what we would say by the book ragis?
Well,
right?
I would say that actually there's probably the opposite to that. They kind of do more a lot. Like one thing I noticed certainly obviously on my recording journey is, and just watching like what's happening in this so-called industry of like Kirtan, is that actually you see a lot of pro ragis, very mainstream ragis, and they'll almost adapt it to the mahal of the Sangat, right? If they feel the vibes from the Sangat, then they'll drop it down to something a little bit easier to follow along. It might not be in the full rag. Or they'll start the smagam. I guess the tradition is that they'll start with the rag shabad, and then they'll go to a more simpler tune after that.
There's lots of accepted stuff like that. They always say, if you want to hear some very good rags, go to Manji Sahib Diwan Hall on Guru Ram Das Ji's Gurpurb, right? When every rated raggi of the Panth will be there. And when they're all there together, you obviously then don't want to give a poor account of yourself, right? They then pull out all the stops, right? And so on, right? So what I would say is that Jatha is absolutely in no way opposed to any of that, right? And as the Panth as a whole, and this makes me really happy, right, to see this, that as a Panth as a whole, we are moving in that direction of hopefully rejuvenating some of that old Kirtan Parampara, bringing back some of the sort of Rubabi, Rita and so on. I know you've been involved in that project, right, with the GSA. The work that the GSA does is brilliant in that respect. I have a huge amount of respect for Harjinder Singh and the project that them guys are doing, right? Jatha will follow suit, right? I hope I can say this on behalf of Jatha. On this occasion, I'm speaking on behalf of Jatha, right? The Jatha will start to follow suit, right, in that way, right? And as the entire Panth moves in that direction, because I think I'm a firm believer that there's different styles of Kirtan, but there's actually very few select people who you can say are really by the book, right, in terms of their approach to Rag Kirtan. Right, or the how the Pratan Kirtan Parampara, how the Kirtan Shailis of that time would have been, right, and the structure of those, right. We don't see a lot of that. Obviously, this whole conversation about Tanti Saaj features in that as well, right? It makes me really happy to see Tanti Saaj, and I would love to see more Tanti Saaj at Jatha Smargams. And again, Jujhar Singh's just about to blow a sort of correct a misconception that Jatha never had anything to do with Tanti Saaj.
Exactly. I mean, just during the time of Bhai Sahib, there was two Singhs in particular who played Tanti Saaj.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. One was called Bhai Lal Singh Sarbloi, who was very close to Bhai Sahib. So before Bhai Sahib went to jail, he would play the taus. And then during the 1940s, there was another Singh called Bhai Darshan Singh, and he was nicknamed Dilruba.
Okay, literally.
Because he used to play Dilruba.
Right.
And so, Tanti
Bhai Sahib
Saaj
was good at nicknames.
Yeah, you'll hear a lot of nicknames, Dilruba Ji, Jaan Sukhala Ji, all these different nicknames for people that he had, Puran Ji, and all these. So, even back in that time, there were Tanti Saaj which were used then in Jatha Smargams where Bhai Sahib was, and even to the point of Gurmat Sangeet Academy. My own children learn off them. Yeah, so I know Harjinder Singh Lally very well,
wonderful.
And their brothers. So.
Oh, that's awesome. I look forward to the day maybe when we see like a fully blown Tanti Saaj ensemble on a stage. And then I guess it really does depend. I mean, I say this obviously not being musical at all, so you'll have to forgive me. I don't learn Kirtan at the moment. Maybe one day, Guru Sahib Ki Padana I will. But like, it's almost like I think we almost get too complicated when we think like, as somebody who's non-musical, just like, what's our impression of what a Raag Kirtan actually is? Like, I've now on this musical journey of like just recording, like, somebody would tell me, okay, what Raag is this Shabadin, or this is a Raag Shabadin. I was like, oh, that was pretty straightforward actually. It wasn't that complicated. It wasn't like you were like, I was able to follow along quite easily. So it's almost like it's up to the Kirtani also to then understand the situation that's presented in front of them in a Darbar Sahib, where they can almost create that situation where the Sangat can follow along. Yeah. It almost doesn't really matter what instruments you have, really, does it? Like, if that makes sense.
True. And the Kirtani often bounces off the Sangat. So that vibration that relationship between the Kirtani and the Sangat is so important, because that will drive the atmosphere as well. So, if the Kirtani is doing Kirtan in a way which the Sangat are enjoying, that will have a two-way impact or effect. And just to bring back to the point of Gurbani is the focus, a story when Bhai Sahib was in jail. They didn't have any instruments there. There's accounts of them doing Kirtan day and night with their kare.
All right.
So to
create the beat.
The beat. Yeah. There's no Saaj in those days. Well, not in those days, but in jail there was no Saaj available for them to use. But there's so many accounts, and you can see in the jail Jittiya on his autobiography of how much Gurbani part was done, and Kirtan was done just with the beat of their kare.
I agree.
There's an important distinction to draw here, right? That is, when we talk about Kirtan, to see, you said it a couple of times now, Chandip, saying what is Kirtan, right? And I see the Jatha approach to it, but I would argue it should be the Panthic approach, really, is that this is not a performance, right? This is not an us and them scenario, right? I'm the performer, you're the audience, right? This is collective worship, right? It's whatever you want to say, right? At the end of the day, for me, it's collective worship, right? You can't say that my worship is to listen to music, right? My worship is to be fully participative in that music.
That's a really interesting point.
Right? Worship tahi honi hai, right? Otherwise, I'm just an observer to somebody else who's worshipping, right? I'm stood on the periphery observing somebody else's worship, right? And that's a key distinction to draw. And I'm not saying here this is Jatha, we're collective and everybody else is not, right? Jehda bhi karda Kirtan, right? As Jujhar Singh just said about sort of the mahal that's created, right? Has to be one of those where you kind of bounce off each other, right? Not a I'm here to perform and you're here to listen.
Involving the sangat or the congregation, right? In participating, like you said.
And that's what kirti is, right? So if the whole sangat is singing, can you just say that the person doing the Vajja is the Kirtani? Everyone's doing Kirtan.
Yeah,
Just because you haven't got an instrument doesn't mean you're doing Kirtan.
I've heard like some things, particularly jehde India to aaye hai, like I'm thinking of one of my sort of close friends. You know, he used to basically say, we used to go to, he's not a Kirtaniya, right? He doesn't do Kirtan himself. But he said, our mindset was, we are seeing we Hajri laun challe hain, right? Yeah. You know, not just the Kirtaniya who happen to sing the Shabad on a harmonium is not the only person who gets his ticket stamped, right? Everybody who's there, who participated, right, from wherever they were sat, right? You are all doing that, as I said, collective worship, right? And that is really crucial, right? Just, I guess, a couple of points here. I mean, there are some extraordinary examples of this, you know, when we think of, I'm not sure whether we should mention names of every Kirtani. Maybe I mentioned, but like obviously one of the more well-known Kirtani personalities in Jatha is Manpreet Singh, Kanpur, right? And there are examples of his Kirtan from khas karke from that Delhi Smagam from Rakabganj Sahib, right? There is one, it's actually a bit of a joke as well, and I think he did get a bit of stick for it at the time as well, that he spoke the first line of his Kirtan, right? And I have to say, you know, like the bakshish that he's got is that that first tuk that he sang, right? Preet Charan Kabira, right? Was the tuk, and when he sang it, right? The second time round, virtually that entire, whatever it is, 10,000 people that were there sang it with him, right? And I think it derailed him a bit, right? So he had to say, just give me a second kind of thing, right? Let me just speak my tukka, right? You guys speak yours back to me, right? You know, that sort of thing of, you know, I'll sing it first and then you sing after me, right? And if you search around on YouTube, you can, on certainly some of the recordings that are out there, people have cut that out, right? Because he does actually say that, right? But on YouTube, you can find it where it says that, right? But it is an example, right, of how within the first tuk, that a real electric atmosphere, right, of the entire Sangat wanting to sing that Shabad, right, together was created, right? And that's the crux of it, man, right? And we've all experienced it. We've all been there. Every single person in here is having a go here, right? Yeah. You know, it creates something else, right? Just going back to the Rag point 1 second, I was going to make one other point about Rag Kirtan where people, and somebody who I'm going to mention later on, Manbir Singh Australia as an example, right? He's done a lot of research into many of the Pratan Rita, the Rababi Rita, as I'm sure Harjinder Singh has done as well, right, here. Some of them Rita are Pratan Rita and they are in Rag, but they're not necessarily in a Rag that's in Guru Granth Sahib. Right? Yes, yeah. You know, so they're often singing a shabd that some Rababis might have sang at Darbar Sahib in the days of old, or Bhai Sahibs Singh might have sang, right? But you know, like a shabd like Heer Pairav, right, is quite popular. Sorry, I said shabd, I meant rag. A rag like Heer Pairav is quite popular, right? To be heard, but it's not a rag that's actually in Guru Granth Sahib, right? Pairav is known as Pairav in Guru Granth Sahib, right? It's the same rag, but Heer Pairav isn't, right? But they might sing a composition in Heer Pairav that's a Pratan Reet, right? So there's still a lot of fluidity even within Rag Kirtan.
So as an outside listener, I mean, I've listened to Akhand Kirtan Jatha Kirtan specifically, like when I was a kid. That's kind of what I grew up on, and now obviously it's a lot more diverse now in terms of styles. But like, if I was to ask like just a general member of Sangat, like what do you attribute Akhand Kirtan Jatha style Kirtan to? It would be that, oh yeah, they're the ones who do like the Simran in the Kirtan, right? I think that's almost like become the definitive kind of style, like where you just get the tabla beat going and then everyone's like jumping Naam, right? Like obviously contraindicated to like what you were saying before, like specifically around Bhai Sahibs Ji's time, it would have been specifically more focused on the Gurbani. That's obviously not to say they don't focus on Gurbani now, but like it doesn't sound like the focus was the Naam Abhiyaas in Kirtan at that time. So is that almost like just, and I dare say the word, is it become more fashionable now? And I say that with utmost respect, obviously. But like, is that like, what's your view on that in terms of the way that the Kirtan has almost kind of changed more towards that? It almost feels like there's like a script. Sometimes it feels like when Kirtan is done, then some Kirtani will like, you'll know, you almost know when the Simran's about to start, right? Because it's like the build up and then you got the low phase, then you build up again. What's your views on that?
I think it's evolved over time. So when we speak to Puratan Singhs, they usually, say Gurbani Rasnate te Naam Hirde vich. That's the way it was done.
Interesting. Yeah.
Back in the day, the focus was on Gurbani. Speaking to some of the Puratan Singhs like Chani Ji, who played tabla with Bhai Sahib for years, often 36, 48, 72 hours even at a time.
Boy, seriously, wow.
So when we asked him this question, was there Simran back in the day? He said very little. And the focus was on Gurbani. So earlier I spoke about Bhai Sahib repeating lines of shabads again and again just to hammer that message home. And then the theme to Kirtan about picking different shabads which relate to that theme to even, drive the message even more focused. So, yeah, and Janji said, if there was, sometimes, Kirtanis did do some Simran. Often when they couldn't hold it in, maybe. But Bhai Sahib, or the Sangat didn't used to stop it. So there's nothing wrong with it. I think it's just evolved over time where you could say it's become more fashionable. But if we look at, even the earlier recordings of, Bhai Meher Singh, you go back to the 1960s where, those kind of Kirtans, Bhai Jeevan Singh, Bhai Meher Singh, Joginder Singh Talwara, they would only do Simran, Jathe Prerna, Jathe, where Gurbani,
where it makes sense
gives you the hukum or gives you the prerna to do that. Not anywhere Naam is mentioned. So that was, I was going back, just referring back to my earlier comment about we become a bit lazy. We haven't got that. Sometimes, I'm talking about myself here, sometimes we don't do that Koj. And if we look at the Puratan style of Kirtan, even in Jatha, the focus was on Gurbani, and Jathe Prerna si Otte Simran kar lo.
One thing I noticed, and Sangat Ji, if you listen to like the albums that we released alongside this podcast around Puratan Kirtan, like for example SDO, right? When they, I would say, break out into Simran, it's very, very intense, like very fast. It's a very short duration, but it's not the style of like, I guess, Simran in terms of like what you would see nowadays, which is the very focused on Swaskaras. And Swaskaras, Sangat Ji, for those of you who don't know, is like when you do Simran based on your breath. So why in inhalation you say why, and then exhalation you say Guru. And that's obviously, it feels like that's a lot more prominent nowadays. But it's just something that I noticed. I don't know what you guys, if that's something that maybe you've picked up on as well.
It's a perfectly accurate observation, right? And I mean, I would probably slightly disagree when you say that SDO Sahib's Kirtan is quite fast Simran. A lot of the time, it was actually very, very Takaki, right? And it was almost sort of, it was at the same pace that the Shabad was being sung at, if you like, right?
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's a good point.
It wasn't, we're going here and then all of a sudden
and then taking it much faster.
It would be at that same pace, just to almost as a bit of emphasizing the message or reinforcing the message type of thing. But I mean, essentially, I'm very much on the same page as Jujar saying in terms of, Gurbani Rasnate Naam Hirde de vich, right? And I remember speaking, I spoke to Gyaniji about this a fair bit, and I spoke to Bhai Santokh Singh Dilli Wale about this, and then Bhai Santokh Singh, who was a Kirtani from Bhai Sahib's time as well, right? he said that the whole Abhiyaas thing, your Simran thing, was kind of your own thing, right? It was almost like, you know, the Gurbani was sang together, right? And then everybody reflected on that Gurbani and went back and applied it in their personal spiritual journeys, which was their Simran that they were doing in their Amrit Wele, most of the time individually. You know, it wasn't a case of that there was, you know, 100 people got together to do Amrit Wele every day or something like that. Neither, you know, a lot of people were doing all this individually in their own houses. And if you imagine you're in the 50s and 60s in Punjab or Delhi or wherever, you know, you wouldn't be traveling around at 2 o'clock in the morning to get together with everyone, right? And stuff like that, right? It was your own sort of journey. And Bhai Sahib had 2 or 3 Nitnem wale Sathi, right, who regularly did Amatullah Nitnem with Bhai Sahib. But I do feel there was a lot more of a distinction between the two things, right? Jada o Abhiyaas hai, o thoda personal cheez hai. And we could really get into a lot of detail about, you know, there are still certain groups in the Panth that even refuse to say the Guru Mantar publicly, right? They feel that it should be kept so secretive that you don't even say the Guru Mantar in public, right? And you can, to some degree, understand where that comes from as well. We Guru ne tuanu mantar deta hai, it's your mantra for yourself, right? Not to be publicly sort of put out there wherever you get that opportunity. You made an interesting point earlier on about how, actually you both made really good points. Jujhar Singh's point about in the Pratan Samad, when they did do it, it was when it kind of came out, right? You couldn't at that point sort of stop yourself from doing it, right? And it was obvious that was the case, right? But you made the earlier point about this thing being scripted nowadays, right? It looks like it's scripted. And I couldn't agree with you more, probably, right? That it is scripted, and the sad fact of that is sometimes the scripting is wrong, right? It is not the appropriate place to be doing it, right? And certainly over time I've witnessed it loads of times, right? You know, I remember once I was sat in a Kirtan and somebody started doing Simran in the Kirtan, and I thought, no, I don't think this was the right place. This is not what you think it is. And I remember just turning around to look at the screen, and there was an elder Singh sat there just underneath the screen, you see, an elder Singh from India. And he looked at me and he went, right? So, right. And this was an experienced Kirtani as well, right? Not just a youngster. I mean, some youngsters, we've made the point earlier on about the importance of understanding Gurbani, right? Some youngsters, classic cases, reading the word Naam, right? And thinking he's talking about Naam when actually he's talking about Bhakt Naam Dev Ji, right? As an example, right?
Yeah, just an example while you're talking about that scripting, the whole scripting thing came to mind. So when we were interviewing maybe Bhupinder Kaur Poop Ji, she told a story where Bhai Sahib had called her for Narangwal Samagam, so Ludhiana Samagam, which happened on Guru Gobind Singh's Gurpurab every year. And
still does.
And still does. And she, so she obviously went down there and had prepared. So with, you know, she was telling us a story where she'd prepared. Like I got 25 shabas. I'm going to be there for 5 days. I've got 25 shabas. That's going to be, you know, enough for me to get through 5 days. Yeah. And she arrived on the first day, and Bhai Sahib ne kya, aajo, you know, called over to Kirtan. And so she did a few, and then she stopped. And Bhai Sahib goes, Bas. Bhai Sahib knew what she had done. And until she didn't do all her 25, he didn't stop her. He said, carry on.
Didn't Bhai Sahib say, jede tayar kite sare pad la?
Yeah. And then after that, I said, ja, kal di tayari kar la.
I mean, we might be going slightly off topic, right? But this is Bhai Sahib's character, right? Yeah. You know, a lot of people say he had this cheeky glint in his eyes always, right? And had this sort of mischievous sort of attitude at times. There's a story from Gyaniji. You might have heard it, right? It's up to you if you want to keep it in here, but I'll just share it anyway. That Gyaniji told this story. I got a new kurta pajama made, right? And I was really proud. My nama kurta pajama pa ke Kirtan te jana aaj. And the kurta pajama was a bit bling, let's say, right? It was a little bit sort of shiny kapra or something, right?
Okay.
And he said, I went into the Kirtan and I sat there, and Bhai Sahib basically says to something, whispered something in some Singh's ear, right? And basically Bhai Sahib said to him, tell him, go take that kurta off, get a kambal on, and go and do Kirtan.
Oh my God. Really?
Yeah.
Why? Okay.
Yeah.
It's in one of the videos. It's in one
Right,
of the videos,
okay.
I'm sure.
I never heard that before. That's hilarious.
Just the other point I wanted to make was obviously we're talking about Naam Simran. Obviously Gurbani was the focus, which the point I was making earlier, but that doesn't mean to say that Naam has no place. Naam, all of Gurbani talks about Naam.
Yeah,
Saskaras Naam, right? That's the ultimate focus of Gurbani to guide us towards Naam. And a lot of the Singhs that we've spoken to describe Samagams as an energy booster. So they'd get together and recharge their batteries, read Gurbani, understand Gurbani, take it in, and then you'd go about your normal life, but you'd be recharged until the next Samagam.
Yeah.
And take that home and have that embedded into your Amrit Vele and your Naam Simran that you do on a daily basis and Nitnem.
I think it's important. People do ask about the Saskaras Naam Simran, and it in itself has been associated with Jatha, right? The Jathe wale karte than hor koi nahi karda. I think the first point to make clear here is that it's not something specific to Jatha, right? Everybody else, all the other recognized Mahapurkh in the Jatha, such as Baba Atar Singh, right, Baba Isha Singh, Baba Nand Singh, etc., all of them, right, also did Abhiyaas in the same way, right? It's not something that was unique to Jatha, right, or anything that was invented by Jatha, if you like, right? And it is within the traditions of looking at the various different sciences of mantra meditation, if you like, right? It is one of the techniques along the way, right? It's not the first and it's not the last technique neither, right? You could argue that ultimately the whole process becomes completely internalized, right? If you want to get into that depth, but probably not. That's not something for this podcast, maybe, right? But it is something certainly that's been in the Gurmat tradition, right, since the outset, right? And obviously Gurbani de vich ta waise bhi the what I often say, the first sort of Ratnam of Sikhs, Gursa Gurka jo Sikh khai, so palke utho naam te aave, right? Ode vich jo saas gras te aaye mera hara, so gurse guru man paave, right? We us gurse guru nu paunde hege jehde saas gras abhyas kar dege naam, right? And in terms of the specific technique, right, there are examples certainly from Bhai Mani Singh's writings, right? Sikhandi Bhagutmala, I think, specifically talks about this technique. There is a letter from Mata Sahib Kaur to the Sangat that talks about the technique in quite sort of specific aspects, saying that your tongue hits the palate of your mouth when you utter Guru outwards, right, from having taken an in-breath to say Wa, right, first. So the technique is not something that was newly created or anything, right? It has certainly been in the Panth since the outset, right? And obviously Bhai Sahib focused on it heavily, and people do see it as a little bit of a Jatha trademark, if you like, maybe more so because of the Kirtan, but ultimately this is your personal spiritual discipline, right? We touched upon it earlier on, right, in terms of if we take Guru Ramdas Ji's hukum there of Guru Satguru Ka Jo Sikh Khai, from there you can take an entire journey through Bhai Gudas Ji to the Redname, Bhai Nandlal Ji, right up to the Akal Takht Sahib Maryada now, right? The one commonality in all of that is that precise point of Amrit Wele da Abhiyaas jehda hega, right, is absolutely critical to your spiritual development, right? So, it's why it's been given the emphasis it's been given, and the fact that Bhai Sahib's written books on the subject, right? Jujhar Singh, I don't know if you...
Yeah, so the Bhai Sahib has written a book on this specific topic. It's called Gurbani Naam Abhiyaas Kamai. So it goes through various techniques and all about Naam Simran. And just the other point I wanted to make here is, throughout, since Bhai Sahib's times and until now, all samagams, and we talked about it earlier, about Akhand parts and Amrit Sanchars. And the point of the Amrit Sanchar was to impart that Naam, Panch Pyare impart that Naam to the Blaki. That was the whole point of that process. So, I mean, we can all say, Naam Simran or do it, but without that bakshish blessing from the Panch Pyare, we impart that technique, that Naam into each Blaki. That is a vital and important part of that process for a Sikh.
Amrit Shakran da matlab ei hai, right? It is like you can say there's a lot of trimmings around the edges of it, but the core focus of it is that your guru is going to basically initiate you, right, through this initiation ceremony, and once you are initiated, basically you've devoted yourself to the guru, you've given your head to the guru is going to give you the mantra back, basically, right? The guru is going to give you the guru mantra, right, at that point. That should be the way we should understand that whole thing. And I would say, Guru Sahib di Bakshish from a young age, right, that is the way we were kind of instructed to understand that whole process, right? We are Guru Twanu Naam Derya, right? And it's not, we could get into a whole other debate, again, probably not for this podcast, right? That it is a parampara that has existed in the spiritual traditions in India since time immemorial, right? Of receiving a mantra of a guru, right? But sada mantra bhi specific hai, sada guru bhi specific hai, right? And sadi playbook, right, in terms of Gurbani is specific as well.
We've talked about how the Jatha started and kind of the musicality of the Jatha and how that's kind of changed over time. What I'd like to understand is what is Akhand Kirtan Jatha in present? And, it's obviously quite widespread across the world. There's Jatha presence in pretty much all majority countries, maybe even some that I probably haven't even heard of. So how did that happen? How did it get so widespread?
I think there's a couple of factors. Probably the one prominent one being, Prathan Singhs going from country to country. The most relevant example I can think of is Bhai Jeevan Singh, also Bhai Rama Singh, going from country to place, like we described, Bhai Sahib used to do, from village to village. And doing Akhand parts, doing Akhand Kirtan, Amrit Sanchars. And I think that model, it wasn't a model which was created, it was just Bhai Jeevan Singh, Prathan Singhs wanted to spread the kushbo that Bhai Sahib had given them, and they wanted to spread that further to the Sangat worldwide. So anyone who knew Bhai Sahib, or Bhai Minder Singh SDO, Jani Ji, all the Prathan Singhs, you should just call them over. And that's how slowly smagams started. I mean, in the UK, I think I can't remember exactly when the first one was, in the 60s sometime, at the Green in Southall. I think Yani Maulik Singh did 4 or 5 hours of Kirtan, because there were very few Kirtan in those days. So that's where it started from the UK. But as you say, it's it's worldwide now. So in most countries, Canada, America, Australia, Malaysia, India, obviously, most of Europe, that there are smagams happening every year. These are scheduled smagams, but again, it's that Sangat get together, recharge, and take that energy back to their own daily lives.
So there isn't like a headquarters, so to speak, of like AKJ, right? Like, it's not like you have like a national office or something. Or like...
I think that's the key point here, right? The success, if you ask me personally, the success from a global presence perspective is simply because of that. That there isn't a HQ, there isn't a somewhere where everybody gravitates to, right? Instead, the Jatha are the ones that gravitate out to Sangat, right? Wherever the Sangat, Jatha wanted to go to that Sangat, and Bhai Jujhar Singh was probably the single most active person in that. We were astounded at the levels of energy they had for that. Literally being constantly sort of on planes going around the world, right? They did all of this before the days of sort of air miles and all that. He would have stacked up a real good score, I reckon, right? But it was that sort of energy and zeal, right, for doing Kirtan all around the world with everyone, and really encouraging youngsters. And the personality of Bhai Sahib that came through was just somebody. It literally like sort of love personified, really. They showed so much power to everybody, right? And that's a key distinction here as well. The Jatha grew because there were people, and I know people now, right, who tell me or told me in the past, right, that main monna siga, right, and I got a jappi from Bhai Sahib, I got a jappi from Purinji, right, to say, tumi sade naal raja, right? Why do you come and join us, right? He said, and that's all it took, right? And there's so many examples of that, countless examples of that, right, that I can give. And that is going back to the earlier points about the modus operandi, was very much, we are never, ever going to have a dera that we get bound to that stops us from going out to Sangat, right? And there's a story that Bhupinder Kaur Poopji told about a smagam in Delhi where there was like an extreme weather event, right, which basically meant that the roads were flooded and stuff like that, right? And as a result, the Singhs couldn't get to the Asthan where the Kirtan was going to be, right? And as a result, the Kirtan didn't happen. And one local businessman in Delhi found that upsetting and felt that, you know what, I'm going to fix this for these guys, right? Rather than, he basically said to Bhai Sahib, rather than you guys having to go around looking for places to do Kirtan all the time, I'm going to build you a place, right? Or I'm going to get you a place, right? And Bhai Sahib was unequivocally, opposed to that whole approach and made it absolutely clear to this individual, I really appreciate what you're trying to do for us, but that is not us. That's not how we operate, right? This is how we want to do stuff, right? We want to go out to Sangat wherever Sangat is. We don't have any expectation of Sangat to have to come to us to listen to us. We'll go wherever they want. And it's probably that mindset that's resulted in this global presence, I guess.
Yeah, and there's no, just to buy this one, there is no data. Bhai Sahib was very opposed to even any self-promotion. There was one example where I think he had gone to a smagam and someone had put his name on the poster. And there was another instance where there was calendars with his name on it. The smagam he didn't go to. He said, I'm not going. Because it's not about me. This is about Guru's message and Prachar. And the calendars, he asked for the Singh to bring them all, and he got them burnt because it had his name on them. So he was always against self-proclamation and never wanted to be called anything other than Bhai Sahib.
How are the smagams organized then? Are they just like basically just around the communities in the area? Like, how do they get organized?
So I think, in India, we spoke about it before, there's, smagams which are set smagams which have been going on since the 60s or Bhai Sahib's times, Delhi and Ludhiana, Amritsar being the most sort of popular ones. In the UK here, we have, a monthly Ranswai, which is scheduled, and then historically we used to have one main smagam international, which used to be around Masaki, or it's scheduled in Easter because we have the holidays here in the UK.
Everyone's free.
Everyone's free. Yeah. But now there's sort of more sort of smagams happening locally as well. So rather than just at Answai, they have maybe a 2-3 day smagam where you have programs at different gurdwara, so there's probably like maybe 3 or 4 main smargams in the year now in the calendar, which sort of get organized on a yearly basis. The main ones are happen to be in Derby, because they have the facilities to sort of accommodate the large number of Sangat there, but not to say that that other areas can't have smargams. If there's other gurdwaras or other areas which would like Kirtan smargams, please do get in touch, and we can always arrange those. But just going back to the point of what Kamaljt Singh was saying earlier about the spread of Jatha all over the world, it goes back to the mentality and sort of the teachings of Guru Sahib as well. Kar kar andar dharam saal, and ujjar jao. That prachar, just go out and do that prachar, and that sort of thread seems to have sort of come through. Obviously Bhai Sahib and all the Prathan Singhs, and that's you see it all over the world today.
Yeah. So there's something that you're actually personally involved in, right? I think it's Bhai Randhir Singh Trust, is it? Can you tell us about that?
Anji, so I think I mentioned earlier, so my Nana Ji was quite instrumental in sort of collating Bhai Sahib's writings in sort of the 60s, 70s. So some of these books Bhai Sahib wrote in jail, so they're in like margins of other books, and so there was a lot of work that he and some of the Singhs at that time did to convert those into sort of the books that we see today. And Bhai Sahib has written sort of about 20 or 30 books and some smaller tracts as well on various aspects of Gurmat, Gursikhi, some of those which we mentioned. So one of our sort of objectives is to sort of do prachar of those writings and spread those, and spread Bhai Sahib's message, which is based on Gurmat. And with that in mind, and I mentioned before, I think in 2011 we got the opportunity to go out to India and actually America and Canada to speak to some of Bhai Sahib's sathis who spent time with him, did Kirtan with him, to just get their first-hand experiences of what it was like in those days, experiences with Bhai Sahib, how he was as a person, the Kirtan. So, we have quite a lot of material which we're working our way through and trying to put that into sort of a 3-part documentary.
Oh, wonderful.
The first part is complete. We've shown it at a couple of places. I think we showed it at Derby in Canada and a couple of places. So, but when we're working on a public release, so we'll share that in due course.
Amazing.
And that was sort of on his Jeevan and his life prior to going to jail. So his early childhood, how he got into Sikhi, that love of Sikhi, how it sort of how he got into that. And then the second part is his jail, once he went to jail, and then thereafter. And the third is sort of the legacy and up to what we see today. So, we're hoping we can obviously share that with you very soon. And those are 2 key projects that we're working on. There's a third project which is translating Bhai Sahib's books into other languages, and also having them as audiobooks and books on sort of e-readers like Amazon and Kindle. So some of them are available. That work is ongoing. There is actually one other project which we're working on, which is trying to make a children's version of some of these books.
Oh, wonderful.
So
okay,
that's in early stages at the moment, but hopefully we'll share that with the Sangat soon.
That's amazing. If somebody wants to support the trust, how can they do that? And also, where can they buy some of the books from?
We've got a website which is bsrstrust.org. So you can visit that, send us an email. We're on Instagram under that handle as well, BSRS Trust. Also on Facebook. SoundCloud also has some of the audiobooks on there. So please check them out, and we can also link it in the description.
Yeah, it'll be in the description for sure. Yeah. Jujhar Singh Ji, what are you currently listening to right now? Like, it doesn't have to be Kirtan, by the way. I'm just like, generally, like, it's just where we find out you like listen to obscure, like, Western music. And I'm just joking. But like, what are you listening to right now?
If I get any time, then I it's mostly as Kirtan. I don't have any specific Kirtan that I can think of. I think it's, I do like to listen to a lot of the Puratan Kirtanis, like Bhai Mehr Singh, Joginder Singh Talwara, Dullah Ji. And I think also I tend to listen to Kirtans where I've been, because you can kind of relive that experience a little bit.
Yeah.
So, the last couple of Derby Smargams been listening to lately. So yeah, I think anything and everything which sort of allows you to reinforce that connection with Gurbani.
Wonderful. And VG, by yourself?
I think a bit like Jujhar Singh's final point, right? I am a bit more, something moved me, right? Something moved me, then I will go back home and probably sort of continue with that for some time, right? I might been to Smargham at the end of last year. I might then listen to, if it was a specific recording from there, for about 6 months. I'll probably keep going over that recording, right?
Yeah.
So I've actually been listening to some recordings from Manchester Smargham last year, right? That I mentioned a point earlier on about the Sufi style singing and stuff, right? I felt there's a couple of Kirtans from Randhir Singh Jammu in that Smargham that were very, very much of that type of feel, right? And to some of the earlier points we made, I remember specifically a couple of like youngsters sat near me, right, singing their hearts out, basically, listening to that Kirtan, right? Stuff like that moves me quite a lot when I can see, especially when these people are from sort of families that might not necessarily be Amritari Gursikh families or Jatha families or whatever, right? They're just arms to Dharam families, right? I mean, there's nothing makes me happy than seeing some Munna kid sat there singing their heart out, right? Yeah. When I see that, I think this is what it's about, right? This is why we're here, right? To make them people sing. So I've been listening to a few of the recordings from there. Equally, also again from last year, I wasn't there, but I'm a huge fan of Manbir Singh, Australia, and his project, right? I think it's a project that absolutely should be supported by everybody. But he did a Kirtan tour of the US last year, about September time, I think, right? And there's a couple of recordings specifically from Indiana, which I thought were absolutely bang on the money, really, right? When everything comes together really, really well in terms of the tabla and everything, right? Excellent recordings. I've listened to them quite a lot, right? I do have quite an interest, I'll be honest with you, in Raag, right? Generally. So occasionally I might listen to a little bit of Shastriya Sangeet, I guess, as well.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah. What would you like to say to the Sangat as your kind of closing remarks? Words of wisdom, I call them.
It's not, I mean, if it's wisdom, then it's Guru's, not mine, right? But probably 3 messages to summarize the discussion that we've had, right? The first is probably about the ekta of the Panth, right? That Sadi Saaj Gursikhan de naal hai, not with a Jathebandi or a group or a sect that we belong to, right? Sadi Saaj Gursikhan de naal hai, because Harek Gursikh di Saaj ekko Guru de naal hai, right? And ultimately, right, sanu koi bhi Gursikh, right, menu cha chad janda koi bhi Gursikh mile, the ones that are attuned to Naam, right? Koi kargal sunaave har Naam ki, right? That is central to my relationship with every Gursikh, right? Jaya Gursikh, Nami Gursikh, right? Then I have the utmost respect and I will fall at their feet, right? I will not check their passport first, right? To see whether they are AKJ, Taksal or whatever, right?
Wait, do they write that on passports now?
yeah, since Brexit. Basically, right? But basically, right, that's the thing, right? Koi kargal sunaave naam ki so lage Gursikha man mitha, right? Minu ona de naal sanjwa, right? That's the first thing. And I would say to every especially every youngster listening to this, right? This is what we are, right? This is who we are, right? And you should all focus on that, right? And let's not create division where there isn't one, right? That's the first point, right? The second point really is about that whole concept of really thinking about what is the state of your conversation with your guru, right? Everything we've talked about here, right? जैसे कीर्तन दे विच बैठे हैं, ਅਸੀਂ ਨਾਲ ਬੋਲਦੇ हैं, that is my galbat with the guru. That's me chit-chatting with the guru, right? It's my chat with the guru, right? Guru is telling me, instructing me. I need to really, really dive into that stuff, right? Just like when you go to a lecture on quantum physics, right? You sit there, you have to focus and concentrate when you're there. Then you go home and you have to read around that subject because it's so complicated, right? You need to read around it. You need to make your notes on it and really get to the sort of crux of it, right? This should be the same relationship you have with your guru, right? You know, right? Don't get too obsessed with, you know, making sure that you look the part and you're dressed in a particular way, right? Think more about that metaphysical relationship with the guru. And then lastly, following on from that, right, the most obvious thing I can say is we apne jeevan de vich shoti change leo, right? Think about incremental change that you make in your life, right? Don't make changes. Don't go from 0 to hero back to 0, right? Instead, go from 0 to 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, holi, right? The number of times, you know, we were involved a little bit in doing a lot of seva in the camps, and the one question that used to constantly come up, I can't wake up in the morning, right? As an example, right, of a question. And the simple answer, I myself asked that question as a youngster, right? I remember asking Puranji that question, right? I managed to be by myself with Puranji and ask him that question. I'm really struggling, right? Their response to me wasn't, oh, if you're struggling, that you've got an issue, right? That was not the response. Or it wasn't that, oh, you need to really reflect on yourself, right? And just sort yourself out. Their response to me was, take 15 minutes off the time that you wake up now, get comfortable with that, and then take another 15 off. And just keep doing that until you get to your target time, right? I felt a bit of an idiot afterwards, I must admit, right?
That's almost pretty too obvious, isn't it, really?
I think it's really obvious, right? Yeah. You know, he's not going to give me any magical formula. You want to do this, yeah, you want to do it, but at the end of the day, your body's used to doing it in a different way, right? Just start to take little bits of time off and you'll get to where you get to, right? All of you set yourself an aim, right? And apne Naam Abhiyaas de vich become focused and solid in that.
No, that's lovely. Thank you, Viji. And how about yourself, Viji?
I think Kamaljt Singh's covered, you know, hit the nail on the head, really. But I would just add, you know, I think if you want to take away one thing from our discussion, or two things, essentially, you know, read Jeevanese of Gursikhs. It gives you inspiration. Not just by Sahib, there's so many other inspirational Gursikhs out there. So, you know, get the books, read their Jeevani. I think, you know, we don't read enough in our com nowadays. If we look back at, you know, our previous generations, they read a lot more, researched a lot more, did a lot more Koj. You know, a lot of the Sangat that you see in the Jatha nowadays came into Gursikhi because of reading Bhai Sahibs Jeevan and books. So, you know, invest that time for your own Jeevan, adding to Bhai Sahib's point earlier. And the second is in that focus on Gurbani, which I think has been a running thread through our whole discussion today. Really, you know, read what the Gurbani is saying, resonate with it, experience it, and live it is what I would say.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate it. There's one final remark that I would like to make. Sangat Ji, if there's anybody out there who knows or of any recordings of existence of Bhai Sahib Randhir Singh, please get in touch with Kirtan Bhai or Akhand Kirtan Jatha by Bhai Jujhar Singh Ji or Bhai Kamaljt Singh Ji. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.